Okay, and can you see the text okay? The size-wise is okay, not too small.
I can see the Vue.js components.
Yeah,
No, yeah, it's fine.
okay.
It's
And
fine,
let me
sir.
know if it gets too small, because I know, say, if you're watching on a laptop, it might be a bit small. Okay. Okay, there's two people joining. Okay, so as I said, we now kind of come back to the front end now, try to improve the front end. Last week we covered about the PWA, so making the progressive web apps, and the ones that you can start install on your phones, and almost behave like a normal native app in the sense you can install, you can run it offline, etc. And today we're going to move on to the next part, which is about the components. So that's part of the Vue. So that's why it says Vue.js components, but it's quite common in many other frameworks as well. Okay, and so why do we need components? So previously, when we went to the demonstration, or we use this example of pet shops, and all the code is in one file, which is the index.html. So that includes the all the index HTML code, all the code for the list of lessons or products, and all the code for the checkout page as well. So the files gets larger, and usually that's not very good because it become as a big file. It's difficult to debug and change, and for someone else, it's difficult to understand as well. So usually it's a good practice. Try to split large files into smaller ones, and that makes the code more maintainable, easier to maintain. And so another advantage of making components is to make the code reusable, and you can make one component and it can be used in multiple places in your app. And so the examples may be a card for displaying product information, and you can make this card into one component. And you might be able to use that in the, let's say, in the product list, or you can also use that in the shopping cart if you need to display the product information there, even though the information might be slightly different than the actual one you display. Okay, and then that's what the components will allow us to do. So allow us to break large files into smaller ones and make them reusable. So you can make one component and it can be used at multiple places in your app. Okay, and what are the components? And the goal is to, as I mentioned, to reduce and simplify your code base by breaking down large files and make them reusable in the sense you don't need to write the same thing again and again. Okay, and this is actually usually how the actual Vue.js apps works. And if you use that seriously to build, say, a commercial product, most of them, the entire app will be break down into multiple components. Actually, sometimes into even multiple layers of components, in the sense you can have the root components, which is the parents of everything, and it has child components, and the child components itself can have even further their own child components and form multiple layers. Okay, and so let's have a look example of component. And so this is some very simple HTML code. So you have a div. Inside div, you have an unloaded list. And so far, you don't have an item, just called component example. Okay, and you can define this few lines of HTML code into a component, and you can give it a name. For example, you can call it my component, which is maybe not the most interesting name, but get the idea across. Okay, then once you define this, you can reuse the component many times in your actual app, And every time you just need to do something like this. And the way it works is very similar to the HTML tags. So you need an opening tag and then followed by the closing tag. And sometimes you can use this way as well if the browser supports. So instead of having open containing tags, you just only have one tag, but which is slash angle bracket at the end. So in a sense, it's almost like a define your own HTML tag. So instead of have say h1p or div, you have your own tag called my components, and it will do whatever you defined that component contains. Okay, and then this is the other part, and make it a bit useful, is say once you define the components, and you can reuse it multiple times, and if you change the component itself, every places where it's used will be updated as well, so you don't have to make changes every places manually. Okay, next just creating the components. So before you can use a component, you have to create or define them. Okay, and then so you always need the root instance. So this is a new view, and basically you have to create a new instance of Vue, and this is what we have been done so far all the time. Before you use Vue, you have to define the root, which is called the root instance, and then the root itself can start including other components. Okay, and when you're creating components, you can register either locally or globally. We will see some examples a little bit later on. So, and the global components can be used anywhere in your application. And then just as the name says, local components usually only used in the Vue instance that's created it. Okay, and if you remember, you can actually have multiple Vue instances in an app. So each instance can associate to, say, different div tags in your HTML file. And for the global components, and once it's defined, it can use in any instance, whereas local components, you can only use in the Vue instance that you created it. So we'll start with a global one. We'll create a component, still call it my component. Okay, and it's like a general practice or recommendation is to name your components in lower cases with hyphens. And it's not recommended using the camel case where you don't have hyphens, but you capitalize each letter, because that might cause some problems later, because when you call the components and in the actual HTML, it does not differentiate between capitals, and you can't use hyphens. That's why it's recommended if you just define or name your component this way. If you have multiple words, they all in lower cases and joined by hyphen. Okay, and so this is actually how you define a global component. So you need to put it before any Vue instance. So this is how we create a Vue instance. We have done that many times before. You create a new Vue object, essentially. And then here it says the element it links to is some element with a hashtag an ID called app. So that's creating our new Vue instance. And this is where you define the global components, and that needs to be defined before the actual Vue instance, so it can be used here if we want to. Yeah, and if we actually look at the how it is defined, so you have Vue. This is like the Vue class dot component. So that means I want to create or register a global component, and this will be the name of your component. So that will be called my component or other names. And then this curly bracket afterwards is what the component does. And in this case, we only have the template. in the sense we only define the, how do I say, the equivalent of HTML. So, but you can also have, say, the JavaScript or CSS as well. But for now, we're going to only just including some HTML code. So here in the HTML part, we said we defined a div, and it has some text says hello from global component. So that means if you use this in your app, it's the equivalent to adding this div element to your app. So to add like a paragraph with a line of text in it. Okay. So, and this is also something quite important. So the old template must be surrounded by a root tag or tag. And so this is okay here. And that is fine because you have only one instance. And then, but later on, for example, maybe let me create example now. Let me start my Visual Studio Code. We are in week 17. Create a new folder. Okay, just waiting for the Visual Studio Code to start. Okay, and shows up on the other monitor. Okay, let's create a new file. I'm gonna still call that index.html for now. Okay, and so in this case, our template is very simple. It only has one div, and we have some text in it. Hello from That's not even automatically close. Okay, and so that's fine. But for example, if you have a more complex component, let's say, and it has an H1 and with some paragraphs inside, and say this is the first paragraph, and maybe say you have a picture inside there somehow as well. Let's say you have image, image.png.
I'm sorry, guys. Too small. The words are. You make them more. Squeeze them already.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna make them bigger.
Please. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Is this better or readable?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's better.
No, okay, yeah, that's fine. And I think that's the thing with the monitor, big monitors. Okay, so let's say if we want to have a component with these three things, we have a heading, have H1, have a paragraph, and have image. Okay, and you can't define just a template like this. You can't just say template and using this. This is the starting of our template, and then that's the end one. Okay, this will not work. It will complain because these are three separate root elements, not as a single one. So what you have to do, you have to put them inside one element. Usually this will be a div. So what you're gonna do is usually do div. And then let me format this slightly. Yeah, if you recognize. So now it will be okay. Now you only has one root element, which is a div, and inside it contains your as many as elements you want. But you have to have only one root element. Otherwise, the Vue gonna complain, say you'll report an error when you try to run it. Okay, that's what this last point means. And yeah, otherwise you will see an error. Okay, and once you define a template, and then you can use it, and you need to add that to your parent's template. So basically, you had this root instance. It has own its template in the sense it has own HTML code where you say the different things you defined in the Vue instance. That's this template. And then if you want to use your own component, you just need to add them to the parent's template. In the sense, we defined my components, okay? And then you need to, if you want to use it, just add them to your parent template, which will be this one here, which is very simple. Okay, and yeah, so maybe we just give it a go to creating this very simple ones. Let me just delete these ones I had. Oh, I need to component example, and I will need that will be the .com/view. So I need to load in the view. That's the minimum things we need, I believe. And then in the body, then we can do the example here now. So we need we need to define. Okay, let's do the div part first. Div hashtag app, and then we'll come back to this after we define the components. Then inside the script, we said we have to define the global component first. So we say view.component, and then I'm gonna register my component. I call it my component. And inside the component, we have the template. Okay, and so I'm gonna just use exactly the same here. Div hello from the global component. Okay. Okay, and then we create a new view instance, and it's gonna link to this div tag with the ID called app. Okay, and then here when you use the app, so inside this actual app, then we can use our component. It doesn't recognize. Let me just try. Oh, it does. So it does recognize as well. I'm surprised. Okay, and then if you run this one in the browser, it should sorry, and it should show what you typed in here. Okay, and let's try that. We're gonna go live server. I think this is the one. Ooh. Cannot be reached. Okay. This might be caused by the things we did last week. We set up these service workers. And so you can see in the application tab and in the service worker, these are the ones we created last week. So even we're not running that now, these are still registered with the browser. So they might still be working. So I have to unregister these. Okay, now it's fine, but I do still have an error. I try to find, that's okay, it says try to find the favicon. We didn't define favicon, but you can see now it displays hello from the global component, and which is just this div we defined here. So you can see it runs this code and replace my components, and with this HTML code we define in the component. Yeah, so that means it's working fine. Obviously, the actual component itself can be much more complex, and you will display more things here. Okay, yeah, so that's that. That should be okay. Okay, now we're gonna see another example and called the local component. If you remember, so the local component are the one which can only be used in the instance that's defined it. Okay, so this is examples of how to create a local component. So first, you don't have to do this, but it's quite common, is the actual definition of the component itself is defined separately. In this case, we define a constant, and which is called component, and this is just a normal JSON object. You can double curly bracket, and it has a property called template, and then the content of what the actual template is. That's basically like a string, which is a value for a template property. Okay, and then now this is still our Vue instance. This is the same before, but now we have this one. This is where you register or create a component. You say, I'm creating a component that's called my component, and the value of that will be called component, which is this one here. So essentially, excuse me. So essentially, my component, it would have a template, which is like this. So it is possible to say, instead of say define the variable called component and then give that value to my component, you can add this one, put them here directly. That also works, but it's just in convention, it's usually easier this way because the component itself can get quite complex, and you put all the definition or content inside here, might make it harder to read. Okay, and you can have multiple components as well. So here we only define the one. You can have multiple ones as well. Yeah, and then this will be the name of the component. So later on, we're actually using that in your code, and you just say my component, and here, which is this one here, will be the HTML code, which all the templates, and it can also have say script and CSS as well. Okay, and so this is what it will look like. Okay, so I'm gonna just update this code a little bit, and so this part, and you don't have to change, which is exactly the same. So the only part changes is here. So instead of Vue.component, which registers a global one, we just say, let me see how much I can, I can reuse most of it. And I'm gonna define a constant, which is called a component. And that it is a JSON object. And it has a property called template, and that's its value. And in this case, we don't need the curly bracket at the end. Sorry, the normal bracket. And you create a Vue instance, and that's where it's the element, where it's linked to or anchored with, and you have components. Okay, So the components is similar to like a data or methods. These are predefined properties. And then once you use that, Vue would know what to do with it. Okay. I'm going to show you something slightly different here. Okay. And then we have components, which is this one here. I defined my first component. Its name is called my component, and its value is called component. And this is this one here. You can see it's a capital C component. And if I save this, and then if I rerun this one here, okay, and it still works. And but if you can anyone see something a little bit odd here? Anyone see anything that's slightly unusual? No? Okay. And so the slightest thing unusual is here. When I defined my name, I call it my component, right? So it's my without hyphen capital C component. But when I use it, I use my hyphen C component. That's what we did before. And when I run it, it still displays. Yeah. And actually, I think if I actually use this in my not work, see? And if I use exactly the same name as I defined here, you would actually get an error. It will say this component does not exist, unknown custom element. Okay. So this is related to the naming things, how you name your components before. So when you name the components, it's inside JavaScript. You can use these capital letters without hyphens. That's okay. But when you call that or you use that in your template, you can't do this. You have to use something like this. You can't have capital, and then you have to use hyphen to join the different letters. Okay, so this can be a bit confusing. So that's why I would recommend you always use single and always use lowercase and join letters by hyphen, and both in the script and in the template, so that always be consistent. Otherwise, if you want to really my component new something like this, and you have to say my component new like this in your code for it to work. Okay. If that's okay with you, then that's completely fine. It's just for me personally, I would prefer the name, component name in the definition and when you use it exactly the same. That's easier. For example, this way Vue Studio Code can pick it up very quickly. If I define this way, and Vue Studio Code will not pick up this, these two are this component I defined. Okay. Yeah, and otherwise, I mean, it's quite straightforward. And so basically you register the component here, and this component, my component is only available to this Vue instance. For example, later on, if you define a new Vue, a different Vue instance, and you, let's say new Vue, and it is linked to this, a different div tag, and this is the div tag called app2. And you can't use that component here. And you want to say my component. And if you run that, and it will not display anything. And it will say unknown custom components, my components did not register. That's because when I try to run using my component here, it will not be there. It's not, say, the second Vue instance is not aware of that component. Whereas the first way, when we do this globally, and you should be able to use both this view and this view instance. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the next. We're going to talk about parent and child component. So one component can have other components inside it, and very much like your an HTML code, you can have body, and inside body you have div. Inside div you have, say, heading h1 or p or something. It's the same for the components. You can have one component called component 1. Inside you have component 2 and 3. For component 2 itself, you can have either, say, other components inside as well. So we keep going, different layers. And again, so we can start to differentiate this. Some are called the parent component, which is the outside one. In this case, component 1. And the inner ones are called child component. So this is component 2 and 3 are the child of component 1. So you can say component 2 and 3 are siblings in this case, which is exactly the same terms we would use to describe HTML elements. Yeah. So in this case, component 1 is the parent of component 2 and 3. And component 2 and 3 are the children of component 1. Okay. So this concept is quite easy, but things get a little bit complicated later when we want to parse data between the parent and child component, which we'll cover this week and maybe sometime some part of the next lecture as well. Yeah, and so you always have the root component, which is a root instance, which is the same thing, and it's always the parent component of all the other components or ancestors of other components. Okay, we already mentioned it's possible to parsing data between the parent and child components, and we do this and with something called props, and which is shorter for properties. Okay, and so a child component should never access its parent's data directly. So a component, in this case, component 2 should not access any data property from component 1 directly. Instead, the parent component should send the data to child component through props. But not the other way around. So only goes from parent to the child and not child to parent. Okay. And so the way we do this is using something called props, which is shorter for properties. Okay. And the properties needs to be actually defined in the child component. And the child component needs to define, say, I'm expecting these 2 different properties or props, and what their names are, what's their type, etc. And then they can use that in the child component template. Okay, and so for example, I can define a props. So that's called a comment. That means I'm expecting something called a comment. Then I can start using that in my template. And the actual value of the comment will be passed to this particular component by its parent. So the comment will be defined in the child component, and its value will be passed from the parent component when it's calling the child component. Okay, and maybe another way to imagine this is like the props is almost like the parameters of function. And so you define what parameters a function has when you create the function, and the values of actual the parameters are given when the code actually call the function, they will give actual values to different property parameters. The parameters is something very similar in the behavior-wise, like the props here. Instead of the props is something for components, not a function. Okay, and this is just to emphasize the idea in terms of this is kind of data is only always one way from parent to child. Okay, so previously we used a V model. That's a typical way of two-way binding. So you bind, let's say, a text field on your HTML page to a property in your data and components. And then whenever one change, the other will change. So if the user enters some new value in the form, the data property will change. Or if you change the data property value in your code, then the form or the value in the form will change accordingly. So that's the two-way. And then the props is one way, data binding. Okay, and the parents can update the data, updates the props, and it's passed on to the child component, and but not the other way around. So it stops the child from, say, changing parents' state accidentally. And so this can be very problematic. So when you try to find some errors, it's actually caused by your child component, which is not even in the code is not in the parent component, whereas data is being changed somewhere else. That's very dangerous. Okay, and if you want to change that particular value, you should change that in the parent only, not in the child. Okay, yeah, and so that's the other thing. Even though we say you should never change the child value, sorry, change the values in the child, and you use the props, but it might still happen. And because when you pass a reference of the, okay, let's say for the complex values, so you can, if you pass a number, say a text or number, that's okay. Let's just copy the values when that's passed to the child component. But if you're passing, say, an object or an array, it's passed by reference. In a sense, it didn't create, the JavaScript didn't create a new copy of the object or an array. It's just pass a pointer to the exactly same object or an array to the child. And if the child makes any changes to the object or an array, it will actually affect the parents as well. So that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want to change the parent data and in the child component. So it has to be very careful. So, and this is not something and that Vue can stop from happening, because this is just the way that JavaScript and how JavaScript scripts work. So you have to, when you have to take care of this when you're writing your code. For example, if you have to pass an object on the array, what you want to do is you probably want to make a copy of that and pass that the reference to that copy to the child component. So that way, the original copy in the parent component will not be affected. Okay, next we have the literal props, and this is still a type of properties, and these are the plain text that can be passed to components. Okay, and the way you use that, or adding the give values to the props, is like in adding attributes to an HTML element. Okay, and so you can see this is a div element, and we have an attribute called ID, and you can have and you can give it a value called app when you use define or creating this div element. And we can do something similar for custom components. You can define certain attributes For example, I want to call it text here, and then you give a value to that prop, and when using in this case called world. Okay, and so in these examples, this is my component, and besides the templates we had this props. As I said, properties, where it can take values from parents, and I will only have one props, which is called text. Okay, and once you done define the props, then you can use it as, say, a data property. And so in template, you can say hello text, and then this part will be replaced with the value of this when it's called, and the syntax, the double curly bracket, is the same as using a data property. And finally, when you're actually using this particular component, and if you want to give the value to the text props, you can set the value as you would do here, treat the text as an attribute of the element. You say text equal to world, and then it will display a text here, say hello world. Yeah, and we're gonna just demonstrate that here. Okay, let me delete these code which are not necessary. Okay, and so first we need to change our definition now. So besides the template, we also have the props now. Again, props itself is like a predefined keyword, just like template, and it will be recognized by Vue. It will know what to do with it. And this is always an array afterwards. So that's square bracket. In the sense you can have multiple props. And in this case, we only has one, and we call it text. You can call it other names. Maybe have another one called long text, or etc. etc. Has multiple ones, but we only use this one. Once you define the props, and then you can use that in your template, just as you would do otherwise with any data property, Vue data property. I can say text. So that's I'm using the text property here in the double curly bracket. Okay, and let's do the exclamation mark as well. Oh, okay, and the rest will be the same. Okay, and here we call my component, and here I just call component. That doesn't really matter. Okay, and if I run now, and it will just display hello from, because the value is the template. It says hello from. The value is text. Currently, we didn't give the text any values when we called it, but if say text, say component, and choose save, and you can see, okay, now here the text is replaced by this, the value we're given to text here. So it says hello from component. Yeah. And you can basically change this one, or you can add multiple ones. So you have text and text2, and you can use text2 in your code as well. Let's say hello from component. Okay, and then so you just have to give it the value as well in here, just as the same one. Something like that. It says hello from component. This is the second prop, next props. Doesn't really make any sense at all. But you can say here we had two props, and you can use both of them. You just have to give them values when you call them. So you bind the value, new component to the text, and new props give to the second props, which is called text2. Okay, now we come up to dynamic props. And so the previous ones, the one we saw so far, is literal props. In the sense, the value is static, it doesn't change. So when you define or using the component this way, the text will always be new component, and text2 will always be next props. Okay, so these doesn't change unless you rewrite the code. But it's actually possible to change the values of, say, the text or text2 dynamically, and this is where the dynamic props comes in. Okay, so here for the dynamic props, the props will be bind to a property that can change, not like just fixed values, static values. Okay, and the binding is just using vbind, and just as you would have done before with the HTML elements. For example, if you want to using Vue to change the attribute of a tag, you use vbind, or use, I think it was just column. So it's the same here. Okay, so you can say vbind text equal to message. Okay, so the text will be the props we defined here, and the message can be a data property from your Vue instance whose value can change. It doesn't have to be literally just a text message. Okay. Okay, and so maybe let's do this very quickly. Let me just get rid of text2. Okay, this is from new component. Actually, yeah, before we do that, we have to do one more thing. So when we do a dynamic props, we want to bind them to some data properties in Vue. And previously, we always define the data as an object in Vue. So it's something like this. And you have a new Vue instance, you have a data property, and the values of data is something like this. You have a name, which is called pet shop. Maybe you have a product list, or just products, which is an array, and order is another array, etc., etc. But all this is always defined as an JSON object. Okay, and for the components, it can have its own data, but the data cannot be a object. It has to be a function. Okay, so this is basically just how Vue is implemented, which is actually limited by the way how JavaScript is implemented. But we're not going to get into too much details. So here, to do exactly the same thing, you do this. And you now say data. Now you have this empty or a pair of bracket, makes it a function. And then for the actual values, you have to say return this object. And then this object here is just exactly the same as before. That part doesn't have to change. It just say the data, it has to be a function, and inside the function, you return the actual data property inside an object. That's all thing. Just one extra step in terms of making the function and then do the return. The actual data property is the way is still a JSON object. That doesn't change. Okay. And for the components, you have to use this way to get your data. And you can, for the root element, for example, these ones here, the root instance or root element, you can use either this as an object or here as a function. So that's the exception for the root element. So just to make things consistent, from now on, we can always use this, regardless of it's a root element or just a component, just to make it consistent. So from now on, you will always see data as a function and return the data properties in a JSON object. Okay, because only this works for the component. Okay, so now we have that sorted, so we can do actually a more complex example. Okay, and so you can see, and here we define our components, and we had one props just called text, and okay, and here, so that's the props, which is what we defined, and this is from its own date function now. So you can see data function in this particular component, it has a property called test1, its value just called testing text. Once you define this, you can use that in your own template, the same way as you would use a props. And you can see now here, the data is a function, and you have to return whatever value that is. Yeah, that's the difference. Okay, and then now, if we look at the root instance, where it's going to using this my component definition, again, the difference only here is now it has a data as a function again as well, no longer an object. So it returns all its data properties. In this case, it has something called the message, which has a value, say, from parent component. Okay, and then now you can bind the props, which is defined here, with the properties you have in the parent component, in this case, message. So that's what you do here. So when you're using the component, the customer component called my components, so this is the same as vbind, but this column, you bind the text, which is a props, to message. Here the message is not a text string, because message is defined in a data property defined in the root instance. So instead, the actual value will be this text will be passed onto your component. Then you'll say, or see here, will be hello from parents, and then testing text. Yeah. Okay, and let's just write that. Okay, and so first we need to change our component definition. So we still have only one props, which is called text, as the same before. Okay, and we're gonna have the text hello from the text that's using my props, and then I'm gonna using tester1. Actually, maybe I say this is component. Okay, I'm gonna just call it text2. Yeah, so that will be defined inside the component itself. As I said, we have to use data as a function, and you have to return all the properties in a JSON object as before, but instead of just listed it, you have to return, and we're gonna just have something called text2. Let's just say text. Or let's call it text from component, means the actual value is not critical, but you define text2 as your component data property, which allows you to be used here. Okay. Okay, and then in terms of actual instance, the changes, we don't have to change the element or the components, still the same. But now we have its own data function. So it's a function and your return the data property. In this case, I call the message. It says from parent component. Okay. And then when you actually do this, and you can, instead of saying text equal to something, this is the literal one. So this will be treated as an actual text string in this case. But then if you say, I'm going to bind text into message, which is this message here, which is a property in the parent component, then the text will be given the value from parent component and will be replaced here. Okay, so you should see hello from parent components. Maybe I should not put from here. Let's just say hello, and you should see hello from parent component and then text from component. Maybe this is called text from child component. Okay, that's exactly what we saw here. So in the particular template, when it's displayed, hello from the text is replaced by the message, which has a value called the parent component, which is parent components. And the second part is just using text2, which is defined in the component itself. It just says text from child component. Okay, and so this might seems like a little bit, say, convoluted way to do this, but what it allows you, so now the Vue instance itself can change the values of message, and then the text will change dynamically as you change the value of message. Make that a dynamic props, or a props bind to a dynamic value instead of a static text. Okay, so okay, what we're trying to say here is just say you define the component data like this inside the data function. So you don't want to define it outside, otherwise you have unintended consequences. Okay, I'm gonna see an examples with so this is say when the object and the array are passed by reference and the new copy is created. And it might have, so when you pass an object and array reference to the child component, and it might have unintended consequences. And I'm going to show an example here. Say, imagine the app needs 3 counters. So these are just counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And each counter starts from 0 and increment independently. That's the behavior we want. So it will start from 1, and you do 2 and 3, 4, etc., etc. And then each counter is a button that you can click. And every time you click, it increases by 1. So if it's 1, you click it by 2, become 2, and 2, click and becomes 3, and so on. Okay. So how to implement this? We can make the counter a component, and then use it 3 times. We can add a variable to store its value. So that's the current value of the counter. So this is kind of like the counter example. Okay, let me create. So let's let's look at the code first before we write it in the code editor. And so you define the counter, which is just a value called 0. And then you had your component, so that's the one we're going to use. That will be represent one counter. And it is a div, and which includes one button. And when the button click is, the counter will increase by 1. So every time when the button is clicked, the value of counter, which is this one here, will increase by 1, starting with 0. In the button itself, it displays the value of counter. Okay, and then when you, then the rate, and then okay, sorry, and this counter here is not this counter. It's instead of it's this counter you define in your data property. So here it's only defined with no value. Okay, and then here is our instance and links to the app, which is this one here, and it has this component called the my component, and its definition is what is here defined, and it has data. It's called message. Okay, I'm going to implement this one in our code now. Let me create a new file. I call this counter. Yeah. I'm gonna call this component counter. I need the we need the we need a view file. Okay, now we are good to go. So in the body, I'm gonna go do the script part first. So I'm gonna define a counter. Do I even need this? And it's a JSON object, has one property called counter with a default value 0. Okay, and then I'm gonna define my component. Yeah. Okay, so that's the other thing, and it's very common. So you would name the name the component with a capital letter. It's almost like a define a class in other languages. Okay, and so in terms of template, it has a div. Oh, it doesn't recognize div here inside the template. Okay, and oh. All it has is just one button, so I'm gonna just do okay, and the button will display the value called the counter, which I'm gonna define later. And when the button is clicked, will increase the counter. Let's see if we can use this. Okay, it seems to be doesn't like the single quote for some reason, but double quote seems to be fine. Let's see. Constant. Okay, and then we also have the on date function, and which all it does is just return counter, which currently is not defined yet. Oh, sorry, just need a return. Don't need curly bracket in this case. Okay, so that defines my component. Then I'm gonna create my Vue instance. Okay, and it's gonna link to our favorite div and call it with the ID app. It will have a component, in this case, I'm gonna call it my component again. And yeah, so the definition itself, I was called my components. I'm gonna still use that. I need to have a data. So that's the properties I'll have in my root component. It's just something called message. Currently is empty. Okay, finally, we're going to come back to the actual body, the root template, and we're going to have the div. And I'm going to use my component 3 times. I think that's that. Yeah. So each component is using this. It has a template inside. It has a button. And when the button doesn't really like any break at all. When the button is clicked, its counter should increase by 1. Okay, let's see. Okay, so if I change this from counter dot HTML. Okay. Okay, so what happened is, doesn't matter which one I click, it actually increases all 3, right? So essentially what happens is, in the template itself, in the template itself, and when you click, it increase the counter value by 1, but this not just affecting the counters or the display of that particular button, it's affecting the display of all the other buttons as well. Yeah. So that's why you click on any of these, or everything else increases. So we restart. Let's start from 1. Yeah. Okay. So this is what we saw. When we click on any of these buttons, everything increases. Okay. So the reason that happens is, and this one we define here, the counter itself is an object. Because it's JSON object, you have this curly bracket, and with a property inside. Okay, when it is referenced, okay. So when it's passed onto the component using the data function, a reference of the object is passed instead of a new copy. So basically here, the data, and it returns counter. So this is this object. And when you do that, reference this one inside this component here, it returns a reference to the original object instead of making a new one. Okay, and then later on, when this was changed by the template itself, for example, increase the value by 1, which is this one, it changes the value of this because, and this one is this reference to the original object. And when you change this, it is the same as change this. And because, and when I created 3 components here, they all referencing to the same counter object. So when one of the components changes, this is when you click on one of these, it will change the value of the original object, which then affects all 3. So that's why if we click any of these, everything else changes as well. Okay. Okay. So, and sometimes this might be what you wanted, but it certainly is not the case here. Okay. So what you need to do is to define this counter objects and inside the component data function. Okay, so previously this counter is here. Now we're gonna move it into our data functions. Then this object then is only available inside each individual component. It will be not shared between components. Every time when a new component is created, it will have its own copy of this. Okay. So, okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that. Now we're going to return, not return this counter as reference to the external one. I'm going to return the actual objects. I'm going to created objects called the counter 0, which is the same as we had before, just outside. But in this case, and it's now inside, and just do a return. Yeah, and everything else will be the same. Okay, I hope this is already refreshed. Now when I click, you can see only that changes, nothing else changes. Yeah, so because each component now have this shared, or sorry, independent or separated counter objects, and the change of one component will not affect the changes in the other components. Okay. Okay, we are a little bit behind, but let's see how far I can go. So if you remember, we did some validation before, and in the first coursework, you have to check whether it's number or letters. And Vue actually has such check building or similar building for the props, and you can check the data types. So you can specify the type, and the Vue gonna check it. You can say, I'm expecting a string or a number or Boolean, or even say it's a function, and then Vue will help you to check it. And you can also specify default values. That means if there's no value passed on to the components, what will the value be? The property, or whether a property must have a value, it can't be empty or undefined. Okay, and so this is the example, and which defines a property, and sorry, we define the property. Its name is called NUM, so that's the name of the property. But instead of, for example, we don't have a property here defined really. Let's look at this one. We have a property which is called text. So here we just give it a name, but instead of just have a name, you can set other values. You can say, I wanted the type to be number and the required to be true. So you have to have it, must have a value, and then default value will be 0. So if there's no value, it will be 0. But these two usually only can have one. If it's required, you don't really give it a default value. And if it's default value, then it's not going to be required. Okay, and this is the code. Okay. Okay, and I'm gonna just do a quick one now, just because we're running time. We're not going to redo the entire example here, and gonna take a little bit long to do. But instead, we're gonna just improve or change the one we had before. So we had a text, and we can set the let's say we can make sure the text and its type is string, because we expect that to be a string. We don't expect that to be a number. And the required is true. What? Sorry, this shouldn't be text. Why still don't like it? Sorry. Yeah, and that's the other thing. And if we're gonna using this, we can't use the array anymore. We have to use the curly bracket. Yeah, now it's happy. And so we have the first property, and is called text, and it has these two extra conditions you want to define on the So the text has to be string, and it's required has to be true. Okay. And then we can do still the same thing. Here we're kind of binding the message to parent component. Okay. So if we look at this one, we bind text to message, and the message here is parents. So okay. So that's itself, and would run completely fine. And if I type in here, okay, and it says hello from parent component and text from the child component. Okay, and oops. Yeah, that's completely fine. Okay, so if I change the value of message from parents, instead of that, I give it some numbers, like say 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then and if I save again, so this one, it should break this room, sorry, break this condition because type is no longer string. Okay, but if I save, you can see it still displays anyway, but you would have a error or warning here. It's not an error, it's a warning. It will say invalid prop. Type check failed for prop text. So it says expect a string, and it says end up with getting a number. Okay. So if you break these rules, Vue would treat it as a warning, not an error. It will still try to display anyway. It will not stop you, but it will give you a warning message here. So then you can see that these are like a validation condition is working, but it doesn't really stop you completely. Okay, yeah, so that's exactly what we hear. When we say change, make it a string, it will give you an error, but it will still display the message anyway. Okay, I think this will come to the last part now. We might have to run slightly over, and it's talking about something called customer events. Okay, and essentially the customer events is used to actually passing messages from child to parent. So the parent can pass data to child using props, and props is not supposed, sorry, the child is not supposed to change the data directly in the parent component. Instead, it can send a event to the parent, like a notification, and then the parent, once received the notification, can make changes, for example, to its data. That's what the event is for. Okay, and then so if you need to listen to the event, you use something like this, and you use $ on an event name. The name will be defined by you, just as a component name. You can choose the name of the event, and it just says when this event happens, run certain functions. Okay, and to send or say trigger the event, you use emit, and followed by a specific name. That will be the name of the event. So you say emit and my event, and then any component listening have on my event will receive that event and do the things which was coded there. Okay, and then so on event, which is the receiving event, is sending events between different components, the aunt, parent or child. And for the parent and child, we must use v-on. Okay, so previously we used say v-on click something. Then here I'm going to using v-on a certain event. You specify an event name. So it's quite similar before. And instead of say listen for or looking out for mouse click, you're looking for a specific event you define. And okay, and we're going to keep working on the counter example. Okay, and this is slightly obscured, but we're going to have the button in a child component, and which is what we do here. We have this my component. It has the button, which is this button defined. Okay, but we wanted the counter in the parent. Okay, so here we display the counters in the parent. Okay, but now, sorry, in the child, but now we don't want that in the child. We want that in the parent, which is a root component. So we'll not be part of the my component to display the actual numbers. Okay. And so what you don't want to do, you don't want the counter to change or mutate inside the child component, as we said, because the counter is in the parent. We never want children to change the parent's data property. So I don't want the counter to change inside the children. So instead, what will happen is the parent, sort of the child, will notify the parent that the counter should be updated. So it will emit an event, and when the parent receives the event, then it will update the value of the counter. Okay. So okay, let's have a look. So we can change this, and so in here when it's clicked, currently we're gonna just change the value directly. In this case, we're not gonna change the value directly. Instead, we can say we're gonna run this function called child increment counter. Okay. Then what this function does, and it will emit this event, a particularly custom event, in this case, just called increment me event. Yeah. So that function is this function. That means when it's clicked, it's gonna in and send out or emit a special event or custom event. Yeah. So we're gonna do that now. And the button at click equal to, let's say, increment, just to make this slightly easier. Increment from child. So this is a text you show on the button. It doesn't really matter. Okay, and so we don't have data anymore. Instead, we're gonna have a method. Do we need a curly bracket? And this is just called increment, and the name is slightly different. Okay, maybe we'll call it child increment, just to make it clear. Okay, and all this does is just emit a custom event. That's all it does. Increment me. Okay. So we link to the app. In the data, we return a counter. So now the actual counter is in the return. Yeah. The actual counter is actually now inside our Vue object. And then we also have the my component. It's called my component. Yeah, that's the same. Okay. Then we add the component to the template. Okay. Here we only need one. I don't need all three. And we say we display the counter here. Oops. Because that's what we defined here. We have a counter, its value is 0. Then had my component. Okay, and then v, or you say at. So that's the same. When the particular event happened, so this is the same as this. So it says when increment me happens, I'm gonna run a function called increment counter. Okay, so the increment counter is a new method, and all it does, it just increase the value of counter by 1. So that goes in here in my main. I'm gonna do methods I'm gonna do increment counter. That's my function. And all it does is this dot counter increase by 1. Okay, and so the logic is slightly complicated. It just says doing something very simple in the sense I define my component. When this button in my component is clicked, it will run this function which emit a special event or custom event called increment me. Okay, and then when you use this component in the parent template, it says when increment me is received, and the at is same as v on, you're gonna run this function. Just like say if it's a v on click, you run some other function. You say v on increment me, you run this function, and this function itself just increase the values of counter by 1. And this counter itself is displayed in here. So as a result, it should display the increase the 1 by 1. Okay. You can't call the increment counter directly inside the component yet. So what it's saying, so this method here is in the parent component. So you can't do this here directly. Instead of, you can only send a message, which will ask the parent component to come. Okay, and so if I look at this one, okay, and so hopefully when I click this button, this should run. And if you keep clicking, you can see now, every time I clicking the button, a message is sent or event is emitted, and the parent component would receive event and then make changes to the value, in this case, increase by 1. Okay, yeah, and so that's it. We're going to stop there in terms of reading. And that's the chapter 6 of the Vue.js book.